More than 200,000 people in the United States have now died after contracting the coronavirus. It is the highest number for any country in the world, even though the U.S. accounts for only about 4% of the global population. In the capital, Washington, the U.S. House of Representatives held a moment of silence for the victims, led by Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
Rise for a moment of silence in remembrance of those more than 200,000 Americans who have passed away from the COVID-19 virus.
Pelosi has blamed the deaths on the disinformation and negligence in tackling the pandemic by the White House. But President Donald Trump insists that the U.S. is rounding the corner in the pandemic, a claim that he has been making for months. The high death toll is putting his handling of the coronavirus outbreak in the spotlight as he campaigns for a second term in office. We asked U.S. citizens in the city of Denver what they had to say about this tragic milestone.
I mean, I don't understand how the richest country in the world could have such an extensive public health crisis.
I feel like if we had real leadership, that the number would be much smaller.
We think Trump has done a good job. I think that there's a story on the other side that wants to say how bad he's handled it, but nobody knew where it was coming from in the beginning or what it was all about.
And DW correspondent Stefan Simon sets us this update from Washington on whether the country is likely to change its course in dealing with the pandemic.
Well, the president didn't promise anything now, today, or yesterday, or last week, or the week before that. The president is busy campaigning, saying that he did everything possible and more than that to curb the threat and the voracious outcome of this COVID-19 pandemic or COVID-19 infections here in the United States. So on part of the president, everything is done very, very well, and he saved the lives of millions in his mind. Democrats are furious about how the president handled this COVID-19 crisis here and say 200,000 deaths in just doubling the number. This number just doubling in 2 or 3 months is a clear sign that the president mishandled this crisis, this pandemic in a very, 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 very large and significant way. I can't foresee any scenario that the United States at this moment will unify after those numbers, after today, after this milestone passing 200,000 deaths, to combat this coronavirus pandemic in any other way.
And that was Stefan Simons in Washington. Amid the criticism of his handling of the pandemic, President Trump has lashed out at China, blaming it for spreading the virus. Trump went on the attack in a pre-recorded message to the UN General Assembly as the world body marks 75 years since its founding. The annual gathering took place with coronavirus restrictions in place.
The perfect riverside spot for a fractious global family get-together at UN headquarters. Face masks and tight security, even though the most distinguished guests joined by video link, a precaution to avoid worsening the coronavirus pandemic that has already killed almost 1 million people worldwide. To a half-empty hall of socially distanced UN ambassadors, UN Chief Antonio Guterres warned about tensions between the US and China, threatening to tear the organization and the world apart.
Let us vanquish the 5 horsemen. Our world cannot afford a future where the 2 largest economies split the globe in a great fracture, each with its own trade and financial rules and internet and artificial intelligence capacities. A technological and economic divide risks inevitably turning into a geostrategic and military divide, and we must avoid these at all costs.
And the increasingly difficult relationship between the 2 superpowers was on show as soon as President Trump's pre-recorded statement started rolling.
Profound honor to address the United Nations General Assembly.
The US leader said the UN should hold Beijing accountable for the COVID-19 crisis. And Trump championed his policy of putting his country's national interests first.
Serbia. For decades, the same tired voices proposed the same failed solutions, pursuing global ambitions at the expense of their own people. As president, I have rejected the failed approaches of the past, and I am proudly putting America first, just as you should be putting your countries first.
With early voting for the US presidential elections already underway in some US states, Trump's speech attacking China on trade and the environment was aimed as much at US voters as other world leaders. In contrast, the pre-recorded speeches from Russia's President Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping urged a global response to the coronavirus pandemic and more cooperation between countries. We should embrace the vision of a community with a shared future. We should see each other as members of the same big family, pursue win-win cooperation and not fall into the trap of a clash of civilizations. This year's General Assembly debate underscores how hard it is to keep countries talking to each other instead of past each other.
We've heard so many times that the best diplomacy is done in person. This year, thanks to the pandemic, we're not getting that. We're getting diplomacy, I guess, on Zoom. Does that make a difference?
I think it really does. I think it really is a real problem, Brent. I mean, of course, it's normal for these speeches by the leaders in the general debate to be used as grandstanding opportunities. And we've certainly seen plenty of that today, and we're going to talk about that, I'm sure, in a moment. But still, like, the event every year in New York is unique in the diplomatic calendar. It's the only time when all of these leaders get an opportunity to come together, and it's what happens outside that chamber, outside those speeches, that really matters, when there are opportunities for the leaders and also their teams to talk to each other and to have kind of serendipitous encounters, which, you know, can be fruitful. So it is a real concern, particularly for believers in diplomacy, believers in the power of multilateralism.
And we heard today, beginning with President Trump, he opened the assembly on the day that America surpassed the 2,000 mark, the death toll from the pandemic.
200,000.
200,000,
right.
rather.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the highest level in the world. And of course, characteristically for Donald Trump, when he's open for criticism, he goes on the attack. And that's what he did very robustly. Within virtually his first breath, he was talking about the China virus. Now, there are genuine concerns about China in the early stages of the outbreak in Wuhan, in the center of the country, at the end of last year, beginning of this, about how transparent they were with the World Health Organization and also with other countries about that. But still, this was pretty aggressive, even by Donald Trump's standards. And also, it's only adding to these fears that the US and China are just headed for a kind of Cold War scenario, which the UN Secretary-General Guterres explicitly warned against in his speech.
Who was Donald Trump speaking to today? I want you to take a look at what the group America First Policies posted immediately after Donald Trump's speech. Take a look.
As we speak, the United States is also working to end the war in Afghanistan, and we are bringing our troops home. America is fulfilling our destiny as peacemaker, but it is peace through strength.
So, Richard, what do we have there? A re-election campaign spot?
I mean, it's not that much of a surprise when we were watching it live earlier. It was a very condensed kind of hit list of Donald Trump's view of the world and what he sees as his achievements. You know, Donald Trump's speeches are usually long, famously rambling. This was wham, bam, bam. So it's not much of a surprise. But, I mean, bear in mind, there is an election in just a few weeks. I think any president who was heading into an election like this would use an event like this to some extent to try and make some political points. But, of course, this was in Trump style.
Let's talk a little bit about global geopolitics and how it's reflected at this meeting. This is what the Russian President Vladimir Putin said today about the status quo, if you will. Take a look.
Russia has suggested convening a G5 summit. It would aim at reaffirming the key principles of behaviour in international affairs, elaborating ways to effectively address today's most burning issues. It is encouraging that our partners have supported the initiative.
Yeah, a G5 summit for the 5 members of the Security Council. What does that tell us about the present-day balance of powers?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because he's standing up for a system that many say is discredited, that the UN Security Council is no longer functioning, that it is in a state of almost permanent deadlock with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping from China on one side, the United States on the other side. And each of those having veto powers, which means that they can each block each other's initiatives. And this has, concrete implications. I mean, look at the war in Syria that dragged on. The Security Council was unable to get over those veto hurdles to do anything meaningful to end that conflict. And many smaller countries, or a particular grouping of smaller countries, of which Germany is a member, is saying that we need to reform the UN Security Council, that it needs to get bigger, they need to get rid of these vetoes, it needs to get more diverse. But the thing is, and what we see from Putin here, of course, the vested interests and the powers of those members of the UN Security Council are just so powerful. And no one likes to give up their powers.
And exactly. No one wants to change the status quo when it means they would lose power. And yet you've got Donald Trump champion an American retreat from multilateralism. We're seeing that. At the same time, you've got the Chinese President Xi Jinping showing the world that China is here to preserve the global order as we know it.
Well, that's his argument. And of course, it's an easier argument to make when you have Donald Trump there essentially saying that, he said that every country should stand up for itself, making the nationalist argument. Of course, China's critics would say, well, Xi Jinping at the same time is involved in a border confrontation with India. It's cracking down on human rights in Hong Kong. It threatens Taiwan with invasion, and it is trying to expand its control within the South China Sea. That these are not the acts of a benign multilateralist power.
And as we go to air, Richard, if you look on the homepage of the New York Times or the Washington Post, for that matter, you will really have to struggle to find an article about these speeches and the UN General Assembly today. What does it tell us? Does the UN, does it still matter?
Well, I noticed the same thing, and it is striking that German news sites are featuring Donald Trump's speech more prominently than many American ones. I think we do have to stress, though, that kind of American neglect and disinterest in the United Nations is nothing that new. I mean, you'll remember back in 1997, Ted Turner, the founder of CNN, donated $1 billion to the United Nations at a time when Congress had stopped paying its dues. George Bush nominated as the ambassador to the UN a man who had said the best thing you could do to the UN was to knock off a bunch of stories from the building. So it's not so new. I think what's more important really is the bigger challenge to the UN at the moment is that so many countries with the US at the pinnacle are led by leaders who question the very idea of international cooperation.
Yeah, that's right. There's lots of enemies right now of multilateralism, and those enemies are in power around the world. Richard Walker, our Chief International Editor. Richard, thank you.